What would you do if your HOA tried to control what you ate at a neighborhood potluck? Not just offering suggestions, actually trying to shut it down, throwing food onto the street, and calling the police over a plate of deviled eggs. If that sounds absurd, welcome to Maple Grove Lane, where one woman's obsession with authority nearly tore a peaceful community apart. I moved to Maple Grove Lane 2 years ago, drawn by its postcard-perfect suburban charm. It was the kind of place where American flags fluttered on porches, golden retrievers lounged in neatly trimmed yards, and neighbors waved as they mowed their lawns. My house, a modest buttercream-colored ranch with blue shutters, sat among rows of similar homes in pastel hues, all maintained under the watchful eye of the Homeowners Association, or HOA. At first, the HOA seemed like a well-oiled machine, keeping the streets pristine, repainting fences, and organizing cheerful yard sales. That's what I thought, until I met Karen. Karen wasn't just a member of the HOA, she was its self-appointed enforcer. She glided through the neighborhood in a fitted blazer, a clipboard tucked under one arm, a scowl always lurking behind her tight-lipped smile. While the official HOA president, Mrs. Caldwell, was fair and level-headed, Karen treated her role like a military operation, inspecting mailboxes for alignment, measuring hedges to the inch, and snapping photos of violations like a detective solving a crime spree. I learned quickly that once Karen decided something was a rule, it became a rule, whether it was written down or not. At first, I kept my head down, nodding politely whenever she made some passive-aggressive remark about lawn care. I figured, how bad could she really be? But then, the Whitakers, a sweet older couple known for their generosity, proposed something simple, a block potluck. A chance for everyone to bring a dish, share a meal, and enjoy an afternoon together. It seemed harmless, until Karen caught wind of it. From that moment on, the war for Maple Grove Lane began. The Whitakers' potluck idea spread quickly. Neighbors chatted about it while tending their gardens, at the mailbox, even in the checkout line at the local grocery store. People were excited, finally, something that felt like community instead of just another row of houses where people lived side by side but barely spoke. A sign-up sheet went around, and within days, the menu was shaping up beautifully: chili, cornbread, salads, casseroles, pies, cookies. Even a neighbor who rarely socialized, Mrs. Parker, promised to bring her famous baked beans. Everything was falling into place until Karen found out. I first overheard her talking to Mr. Whitaker in his driveway. Her voice, usually crisp and composed, had a sharp edge to it. Absolutely no mention of a potluck was approved by me or the board. Mr. Whitaker, ever the gentleman, tried to explain that they weren't blocking off the street or setting up anything disruptive, just some folding tables on his lawn near the sidewalk, nothing more. But Karen wasn't listening. She had already decided this was a violation of HOA regulations, even though the official guidelines said nothing about neighborhood gatherings. By the next morning, she had taken things a step further. A bright yellow notice was taped to the Whitakers' front door, bearing an official-looking HOA seal. It stated that the event was under review due to community concerns and might be subject to fines. The problem? It was fake. There had been no official meeting, no board discussion, just Karen, acting on her own authority. But that didn't stop her from going door to door, warning neighbors that attending could result in penalties. She even told Mrs. Dawson, a single mother with 2 kids, that participating might affect her ability to get future approvals for home repairs. If Karen's goal was to scare people, it worked, for about 5 minutes. Then Mrs. Caldwell, the actual HOA president, got involved. Furious, she called an emergency meeting, exposing Karen's violation notices as completely fraudulent. The HOA had no authority to fine anyone for having a neighborhood potluck. In one short conversation, Karen's first attempt to sabotage the gathering collapsed. But she wasn't done. The morning of the potluck, new warnings appeared, this time, in mailboxes. Printed on official-looking letterhead, they claimed that anyone who brought food could be personally liable for food poisoning or allergic reactions. The letter cited bogus city ordinances about unauthorized food distribution and claimed a permit was required. But when Mrs. Caldwell and another board member, Mr. Reynolds, called the city to confirm, they learned no such rule existed. People were beginning to see Karen for what she really was, a control freak who would do anything to get her way. Despite her warnings, the potluck setup began. Tables were arranged, white tablecloths fluttered in the breeze, and neighbors started bringing over their dishes. The smell of grilled burgers and fresh cornbread filled the air. The first guests arrived, chatting excitedly. It was a perfect summer day. And then Karen showed up. She marched down the street with the air of a warden inspecting inmates. Clipboard in one hand, her lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. She stopped at the edge of the gathering, scanning the tables as if she were looking for evidence of criminal activity. And then, a man in a uniform arrived. He had a notepad and a badge clipped to his belt. Karen stepped forward, smiling smugly, and gestured to the food. "Right on time. I called to report an unauthorized public dining event in violation of food safety laws." A wave of murmurs spread. People exchanged worried glances. Was this real? Had Karen actually called in a city inspector to shut them down? The man cleared his throat, flipping open his notepad. "I need to inspect all food items. Can you tell me who prepared these dishes and what food safety precautions were taken?" The Whitakers looked stunned. This wasn't a restaurant. It was a potluck. Mrs. Parker, who had brought baked beans, frowned. "Excuse me? What kind of question is that?" The man scribbled something down. "Was your dish kept at the correct temperature before serving?" Mr. Whitaker narrowed his eyes. "May I see your credentials?" A pause. The man hesitated, glancing at Karen. Something felt off. Miss Becker, another board member, stepped forward. "Sir, could you provide your department and office?" The man shifted uncomfortably. Then, under pressure, he mumbled something about being a private contractor. That was it. Karen hadn't called the city. She had hired someone, a friend, an acquaintance, maybe even a private investigator, to pretend to be an inspector. The crowd erupted. Shouts of, "Are you kidding me?" and "You had someone fake an inspection," rang out. Karen's smug expression cracked, but before she could explain herself, the so-called inspector turned and hurried away, clearly realizing he had been caught. Mrs. Caldwell shook her head. "Karen, you just staged a fake government inspection to shut down a neighborhood event. Do you realize how serious that is?" But Karen's expression darkened. If she couldn't scare people into canceling, she'd take matters into her own hands. Without another word, she stepped forward, grabbed a plate of pasta salad, and hurled it into the street. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Food scattered across the pavement, pasta rolling down the gutter. Karen turned, eyes wild. "You were warned. This is an illegal gathering, and I will not allow it." She reached for a platter of cookies. But this time, someone stopped her. Mr. Whitaker, normally the kindest, most easygoing man on the block, caught her wrist mid-air. His voice, usually warm and friendly, was ice cold. "That's enough." Karen yanked her arm free, glaring, breathing hard. Around her, the entire neighborhood stood frozen, watching in stunned disbelief. The woman who had spent years bullying and controlling the HOA had just publicly lost control. And the worst part? She wasn't done yet. For a moment, the world stood still. The pasta salad lay strewn across the pavement, a splattered casualty of Karen's meltdown. The neighbors, once chattering and laughing over shared dishes, were now frozen in shock. The sheer audacity of what they had just witnessed, an HOA officer physically destroying food in a fit of rage, was almost beyond comprehension. Then, all at once, the silence broke. "Are you insane?" someone shouted. "You have no right," another voice added. A ripple of outrage spread through the gathering. Karen, her chest rising and falling in short, rapid breaths, lifted her clipboard like a shield. "This potluck is unauthorized. I've told you all repeatedly. If you won't listen to reason, I have no choice but to shut it down myself." Her gaze flicked toward the dessert table. In a movement so fast it was almost reflexive, she lunged for a plate of cookies. But this time, the neighborhood was ready. Mr. Whitaker stepped in front of the table, arms crossed. Mrs. Caldwell moved beside him, standing firm. Even Mrs. Parker, who usually kept to herself, clenched her jaw and shielded her baked beans with both hands as if she were defending a national treasure. "Enough," Mrs. Caldwell's voice was calm but filled with quiet fury. "Karen, if you touch one more dish, you will regret it." Karen scoffed, but something in Mrs. Caldwell's stare made her hesitate. She wasn't just facing one or two people anymore, she was facing the entire neighborhood. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Then, in a final act of desperation, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The crowd gasped again. A few exchanged nervous glances. The police? Over a potluck? What would they even do? But Karen's voice was sharp and clear as she spoke into the receiver. "Hello? Yes, I need officers immediately. There's an illegal public gathering happening on Maple Grove Lane, and the residents are refusing to disperse. They're serving unregulated food in unsafe conditions. I'm concerned for public health and safety." "Yes. Yes, I'll wait." She snapped the phone shut, a satisfied smirk playing at her lips. She thought she had won. Minutes passed, thick with tension. Neighbors whispered amongst themselves, wondering what would happen. Would the police really shut them down? Would there be fines? Would they be forced to pack up and admit defeat? Then, a patrol car pulled onto the street. The potluck fell silent. People stood still, watching as a uniformed officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the scene. Karen practically leaped toward him. "Officer! Thank goodness you're here. This event is a clear violation of HOA and city regulations. They're blocking public sidewalks, serving food without permits, and putting everyone at risk. I demand you take action immediately." The officer, an older man with tired eyes, let out a slow breath. He turned toward the tables, scanning the completely peaceful gathering before him. People were standing in small groups, chatting, laughing, some still holding plates of half-eaten food. A few children were running in the grass, utterly oblivious to the so-called riot Karen had described. He rubbed his forehead. "Ma'am, are you telling me you called 911, over a potluck?" Karen straightened. "It's not just a potluck. It's an unauthorized public dining event with potential health violations." The officer held up a hand, silencing her. He turned to Mrs. Caldwell, who stood beside Mr. Whitaker, arms folded. "Ma'am, are you the HOA president?" Mrs. Caldwell nodded. "Yes, I am. And I can assure you, this gathering is completely within our community guidelines. We've already addressed Karen's concerns." The officer sighed. "So, just to be clear, this is a neighborhood event on private property?" "That's right," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. "All right. I don't see any violations here." Karen's face twisted. "What? That's impossible. Look at all this food. Look at these tables. They're obstructing pedestrian walkways." The officer tilted his head. "Ma'am, I can see the sidewalk just fine. There's more than enough room for people to pass. There's no excessive noise, no complaints from other residents, and certainly no crime being committed." Karen's jaw tensed. She was losing. The officer turned back to the crowd, raising his hands. "Folks, you're good to go. Enjoy your afternoon." A cheer erupted. Someone actually started clapping, and soon, the whole block was cheering and laughing as the tension melted away. Karen's face went pale. She had failed. Her final move, the police, the ultimate show of force, had backfired spectacularly. Mrs. Caldwell, ever the diplomat, turned to Karen and offered her a plate. "Karen, would you like to stay for some food? Maybe a drink?" A few people snickered. The invitation was half sincere, half mockery, an olive branch wrapped in the undeniable fact that Karen had lost, and everyone knew it. Karen's eyes burned with frustration. She stood there for a long moment, her hands curled into fists at her sides, her breath heavy with the weight of her failure. Then, without a word, she spun on her heel and marched away. And that was the end of Karen's reign over Maple Grove Lane. Karen stormed down the sidewalk, her heels clicking against the pavement like a judge's gavel, her clipboard clutched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The neighborhood behind her had descended into celebration, neighbors laughing, toasting with plastic cups of lemonade, and enjoying the very event she had tried to destroy. But Karen wasn't done. Not yet. She didn't just want to shut down the potluck, she wanted consequences. Real consequences. If the police wouldn't handle it, someone else would. She yanked out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, her mind racing. The City Code Enforcement Office. The County Health Department. Zoning authorities. She had spent years memorizing every obscure municipal law, every minor regulation, every bureaucratic loophole she could twist into a weapon. And now? She was about to unload every last one of them. Her fingers flew across the screen. Complaint emails. Voicemails dripping with righteous fury. A string of formal grievances filed through the city's online portal. Then, she made her next move. A second police call. Her voice was calmer this time, measured, the tone of someone who had just witnessed something deeply concerning. "Yes, I called earlier about an unauthorized event. I need to escalate the complaint. The HOA president is allowing this violation to continue despite clear health risks. There are unregulated food items sitting out in the sun, and I overheard someone mentioning allergies. If someone gets sick, the city could be liable. This is an urgent matter." She paused, adding the perfect touch of alarm. "I also have reason to believe they're serving alcohol without a permit. That should do it." She clicked send on her final complaint, took a deep breath, and waited. Meanwhile, back at the potluck, the mood had shifted from defiant to triumphant. Mrs. Caldwell had announced the police had no issues with the event, and the community had responded with cheers and renewed excitement. Plates were refilled, conversations resumed, and people who had hesitated to attend earlier now poured in from the surrounding streets. Karen's meltdown had only made the potluck bigger. Then, about 30 minutes later, another patrol car rolled onto Maple Grove Lane. The laughter quieted. Conversations stilled. The sound of folding chairs shifting filled the air as people turned to watch. A uniformed officer stepped out, a different one from before. He adjusted his sunglasses, scanned the gathering, and let out a sigh as if he already knew this was a waste of his time. Karen rushed forward. "Officer. Thank you for coming. I appreciate you escalating this. The residents are serving food in an unregulated setting, which poses a clear health hazard. There's also the issue of alcohol permits. It's a public disturbance at this point." The officer glanced at the tables. Plastic cups of lemonade. Cans of soda. A few neighbors sipping iced tea. He arched a brow. "Ma'am, where's the alcohol?" Karen hesitated. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. Mr. Whitaker, who had just taken a bite of chili, chuckled. "Unless she's talking about my secret recipe sweet tea, I think she's making things up." A few people laughed. The tension in the air cracked like thin ice. The officer sighed and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, I see no violations here. I spoke to another officer who was already here earlier. The event is within HOA and city guidelines." Karen's face twitched. But you don't understand. These things can lead to lawsuits, liabilities." The officer, clearly having had enough, lowered his sunglasses and looked her dead in the eye. "Ma'am, do you realize that filing false reports can be considered misuse of emergency services?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's mouth opened. Then closed. Then opened again. The officer gave her a long, meaningful stare. Karen shut her mouth. The officer exhaled, turned to Mrs. Caldwell, and extended a hand. "Apologies for the disruption. You all enjoy your afternoon." This time, the cheering was deafening. Karen stood frozen as the officer returned to his car, shaking his head. The moment the patrol car drove off, someone started clapping, then another, and another, until the entire neighborhood erupted into applause. Karen's face burned with humiliation. This wasn't just a loss. This was a public defeat. Her reputation, her authority, everything she had built over the years by controlling and intimidating this neighborhood, had crumbled in real time. And then, in the cruelest twist of fate, someone shouted, "Come on, Karen, grab a plate before the food runs out." Laughter. Applause. Karen's fists clenched at her sides. Her eyes burned with fury. She had never lost control like this before. And yet, here she was, watching everything slip through her fingers. Without another word, she turned and walked away. She didn't stop. Not when she reached the end of the street. Not when she heard another roar of laughter behind her. She just kept walking. And for the first time in Maple Grove Lane's history, Karen was silent. In the days that followed, Karen's defeat became the talk of Maple Grove Lane. The potluck, once a simple neighborhood gathering, had transformed into a defining moment of resistance against her reign of control. The story spread quickly, neighbors whispered about it while watering their lawns, the HOA board received emails of support, and even nearby communities caught wind of the woman who had called the police over a plate of chili. But the consequences of her actions weren't just neighborhood gossip. The HOA board wasted no time in responding. Within a week, Mrs. Caldwell called for an emergency meeting, inviting all residents to discuss Karen's behavior. The turnout was massive. Folding chairs filled the Whitakers' driveway as people gathered, some still fuming over what had happened, others just eager to ensure it never happened again. Karen showed up, her usual confident stance noticeably absent. She stood at the back, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line as Mrs. Caldwell addressed the crowd. "After careful review, we have decided that Karen will no longer have the authority to issue violations, fines, or warnings of any kind." A wave of satisfaction spread through the crowd. While she technically remained a board member, her power had been stripped away. No more clipboard inspections. No more bogus emails threatening fines. Karen, once the most feared figure on the street, had been reduced to nothing more than an HOA member with no real influence. From then on, things changed. The neighborhood felt lighter, more relaxed. People no longer lived in fear of receiving surprise citations about hedge heights or mailbox colors. Barbecues, small gatherings, and kids playing outside became more frequent, things Karen would have once shut down with a single email. And as for Karen, she kept her distance. She still walked the street, but there was no more barking orders, no more cold, disapproving glares. Some said she had learned her lesson. Others believed she was biding her time. But the difference now? Nobody cared what she thought anymore. Months later, the Whitakers hosted another small cookout. Nothing big, just some grilled burgers, iced tea, and a few close friends. But this time, Karen showed up. She lingered at the fence, hesitant. It was clear she wasn't invited, yet she had come anyway. Mr. Whitaker, ever the gentleman, waved her over. "You want a burger?" For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, finally, she nodded. It wasn't an apology, nor was it an attempt to mend things. But it was something. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Have you ever had a Karen in your HOA or neighborhood? How did you deal with it? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.